The Israeli military has said that 200 of its soldiers have been killed in Gaza since its ground operations began in late October. This comes on a day when close to 200 Palestinians were killed in the last 24 hours alone, and the death toll in Gaza crossed the 25,000 mark. This according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. Meanwhile, the Israeli military has seen its highest single-day death toll since the war began. 21 soldiers were killed when a rocket-propelled grenade hit a tank that was guarding Israeli forces. At the same time, an explosion occurred in two buildings where forces had planted explosives. Earlier, 3 Israeli army officers were also killed during combat operations in southern Gaza. The numbers are mounting, and so is the pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Relatives of Israelis held hostage in Gaza interrupted a parliamentary meeting, demanding the government to take urgent action for their release. The group broke into a meeting of the Knesset's Finance Committee, chanting "Everybody and now" to urge the return of all hostages.
What happened today at the Knesset was an expression of immense sorrow and pain that cannot longer be contained, and we're no longer asking for pity, we're asking for action.
Family members and supporters also protested near Netanyahu's residence in Jerusalem. They spilled blood-red liquid on a road and banged drums. This comes as European foreign ministers press Israel on a two-state solution. At a meeting in Brussels, they criticised Netanyahu's clear rejection of the creation of a Palestinian state. Meanwhile, Britain, Australia and the United States have unveiled new asset freezes and travel bans on Hamas financiers. The US also announced sanctions on Iraqi airline Fly Baghdad, saying it provided assistance to Iran's military wing. Washington says the move is a response to Iran-backed militias' regular strikes against bases housing US forces in Iraq and Syria. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by our correspondent, Jodie Cohen, joining us live from Herzliya. Jodie, many thanks for your time this morning. This has been called the worst day for Israel in the fighting so far, and obviously growing calls for a ceasefire. How do you see things playing out from here?
Hi Oliver. So as you said, this has been called the deadliest day since the 7th of October for Israel. 21 soldiers have been killed, including one from here in this community of Herzliya, and many more have been injured as well. And remember, this is a people's army with compulsory conscription and often reserve duty too, and many of those killed were reservists who were soon to be sent home. Whether or not we'll see an end to the fighting remains to be seen. We've seen some protests calling for the war to end. We've also seen weekly protests supporting the families of the hostages and calling on the government to do everything possible to do a deal to get those hostages back home. We've also, though, seen small protests calling on the government not to scale down the fighting, and that's because they believe that military pressure is what is going to lead Hamas to a serious deal ultimately. So we're unlikely to see a full ceasefire now, and that's because Israel says that would leave Hamas on the border and still posing a threat to Israel. And remember, Hamas has said that they plan to carry out more 7th of October style massacres again and again against Israel. Now, the Israeli government have set goals saying that they need to dismantle Hamas and free the more than 130 hostages still being held captive in Gaza, including a 4-year-old boy and his 1-year-old baby brother. So it's unlikely that we're going to see the fighting stop anytime soon.
Well, you mentioned those hostages, and obviously huge negotiations going on. What's the latest on the hostages being released, and also perhaps the longer term discussion about this two-state solution?
Right, so on Monday, Prime Minister Netanyahu reportedly told some representatives of the hostage families that they hadn't received a serious deal from Hamas, but that Israel had proposed its own deal. And that would involve a pause for 2 months in the fighting, that Hamas would release all the hostages in staged releases, and that Israel would also release a significant number of Palestinian security prisoners early from prison. And according to reports, it could also involve Hamas leaders being exiled abroad. So it remains to be seen if Hamas will accept this. But Israel is reportedly cautiously optimistic. Meanwhile, as you said, there was this EU meeting on talk of a potential two-state solution, and very, 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 very early days. And there's not huge optimism on that front. The sentiment at that meeting is that the political resolution would resolve this conflict once and for all. But the feeling in Israel is that ideologically that wouldn't work, because Hamas won't accept a two-state solution, and also practically that it wouldn't work, with Eylon Levy, the Prime Minister's spokesperson, quoting Palestinian polls showing that more than 80% of Palestinians in the West Bank support Hamas and their 7th of October massacre against Israel. But while Netanyahu has ruled out a full Palestinian state without Israeli security control, he has talked repeatedly about the Palestinians having all the power to govern themselves with none of the power to harm Israel. And commentators are talking about a potential resolution of perhaps a Palestinian state with Israeli security oversight. Now, President Biden, after he had his call recently with Prime Minister Netanyahu, in comments to the press, he pointed to a number of states that don't have militaries. But the Palestinians have rejected all former two-state solution proposals before. So it remains to be seen what they say about this idea, and also about the hostage release proposal as well.
Jodie Cohen joining us live from Herzliya. Many thanks for your insight there.